Okay, well, welcome everyone. So this is the second of a series of 3 lectures on the history of anti-Semitism. Last week, we looked at the origins of anti-Semitism, going deep into history. But I would imagine many of you undoubtedly want to know about the state of anti-Semitism in the United States today. The Anti-Defamation League has tracked some 1,525 incidents of anti-Semitism this year alone. And we're only in the second month of this year. But to fully appreciate and understand where we are today, it's instructive to look at how anti-Semitism has evolved in this country over the past centuries. So let's go back to the middle of the 17th century when Jews first came to this country. And when they did come to this country, they were, for the most part, welcome. And for much of American history, anti-Semitism actually remained dormant. And in America, Jews did not face the intensity of bigotry and intolerance that confronted Jews in Europe. The history of Jews in America is really the quintessential immigrant success story. Yet, throughout American history, Jews have had to struggle for social acceptance. They've had to overcome periodic outbursts of anti-Semitism that sometimes took some very ugly forms, particularly in the 20th century. Jews in this country had to negotiate the tensions between what it means to be a Jew on the one hand and what it means to be an American, looking inward to a Jewish tradition while adapting to life in a secular America. So let us now look at anti-Semitism in America. The first arrivals came in September 1654, when 23 Jews landed in New York City, which was then known as New Amsterdam. And these Jews came from a Dutch colony in Brazil. On this map, you see the town of Recife. And Jews were prosperous and free to practice Judaism in Recife. But in 1654, the Portuguese captured the town, and the Jews living there feared the Inquisition. And so they fled for Dutch colonies elsewhere in the New World. And so when these 23 Jews from Recife arrived in New Amsterdam, they were not well received by Governor Peter Stuyvesant. He thought of Jews as, quote, that deceitful race. He thought Jews would infect the Dutch colony in New Amsterdam. But 20% of the shareholders of the Dutch East India Company were Jews, and so they persuaded Stuyvesant to accept these Jewish exiles. After the British took control of the 13 colonies, the first American Jewish community petitioned for the right to worship in 1685, but they were refused by the Court of the Common Council in London. The council stated that the right to worship belonged only to those who professed faith in Christ. But by the 18th century, synagogues were increasingly being tolerated in the 13 colonies. Despite some prejudice and religious intolerance, American Jews in the 17th and 18th centuries in the New World had more freedom and fewer problems than Jews anywhere else in the world. America was, in fact, the best place for Jews in 3,500 years of Jewish history up to that point, because America was a growing place that welcomed anyone who was willing to contribute to the economy. trade was absolutely essential to the prosperity of the colonies. And Jews brought useful commercial skills and experiences that promoted trade. In addition, America contained a variety of people. There were people of German descent, Irish, French, Welsh, Scottish descent. And in such an ethnically diverse society, Jews did not stick out as the other, as the stranger, as they did in the more homogeneous European nations. And unlike European nations with established churches, America had many religions. There were Catholics, Jews, Quakers, Methodists, Mennonites. And so that prevented the establishment of an official state religion. And there was free land and great economic opportunity in colonial America. And so Jews didn't have to compete with Gentiles over scarce resources as they had to in Europe. And America was a place where the government, except in the very earliest years of the colonial era, where the government presented no obstacle to the practice of Judaism. And perhaps most importantly, in other places where Jews lived, the majority population regarded Jews as the lowest group in their particular society. But as free people with white skin in America, Jews were sheltered from the racism that targeted Blacks, Latinos, Asians, and other people of color. And so for the first time, Jews were not the most different part of the population, as they were in the more homogeneous countries in Europe. But the Jewish population in America grew very slowly. Most Jews lived along the Atlantic coast in New York City, Newport, Rhode Island, Charleston, Savannah, Philadelphia, and many earned their living as merchants. Some even participated in the slave trade, but most owned small stores that were family businesses. So here we see some statistics about the growth of the Jewish population in colonial America. From the 23 who first arrived in 1654, the number of Jews didn't really increase exponentially. There were only 200 Jews by 1700, 2,500 by 1776. Now, the founding fathers were somewhat ambivalent about Jews. As president, George Washington wanted to reassure the American Jewish community that it would not face discrimination in the now independent United States. And so he sent a letter to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, proclaiming that the government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. And went on to say that may the children of the stock of Abraham dwell in this land and continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants. Now that message from George Washington is read every year by the congregants of the Toros Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island. I'm sure that if you attend the film on March 22nd, you'll hear a little more about Washington's tolerant attitude about religious freedom. However, our second president, John Adams, looked forward to the day when Jews would become liberal Unitarian Christians. And our third president, Thomas Jefferson, thought Jews needed more secular learning. Jefferson didn't consider that a Yiddish-speaking Jew who knew the Talmud was particularly useful to American society. Now, interestingly, after Jefferson's death, his estate fell into disrepair, and it was Uriah Phillips Levy, the first Jewish officer in the US Navy, who purchased Jefferson's estate in Monticello. And after a long and costly program of renovation, Levy's will directed that Monticello be left to the people of the United States. So if you had the opportunity to visit Jefferson's home in Monticello, we have to give credit to Uriah Levy for renovating that home and making it available to the American public. Now, after American independence, few states were interested in giving Jews, or Catholics for that matter, the right to hold public office. Even after 1789, 8 of the original 13 states continued to deny Jews equal political rights. It wasn't until 1885 that the last of the original states, North Carolina, granted Jews full political equality. 1885. But before the Civil War, Jews in America were generally accepted. They were not impeded, as were other marginal groups in 19th century America. And so, for example, they weren't victimized and exploited, as were Irish Catholics. They weren't forced to relocate, as were Native Americans. And they were not enslaved, like African Americans. Jews were objects of prejudice in some people's minds, but they were allowed to follow their own pursuits unhindered. They might have come into conflict with Christians by conducting retail businesses on Sunday, and some Americans found Jewish customs rather strange, particularly Jewish dietary laws. But on the whole, Jews intermingled socially with Christians, and intermarriage between Jews and Christians in America was not uncommon. Large numbers of Jews began to arrive in America beginning in the 1840s. They came mostly from Central Europe, particularly from the German states. So here is a graph showing Jewish immigration to America from 1700 to 1860, just before the Civil War. And so, as I mentioned, the number of Jews coming to America really were relatively few. Got a little more increase by 1824, but starting in 1840, particularly from the German states, Jews began to arrive in America in numbers. It was in the 1840s that there were revolutions throughout the German states to introduce more democracy, but those revolutions were suppressed. And German Jews involved in those revolutions fled from the German states to avoid persecution, and many of them came to the United States. And so from this chart, you can see on the eve of the Civil War, there were 150,000 Jews in America. There was also a large-scale immigration of Catholics from Ireland and the German states, and they brought with them anti-Semitic feelings that had been nurtured in their home countries, in Ireland and the German states. And so given that, along with a growing anti-immigrant feeling among the general population in America, in the 1850s, Jews began to be targets of verbal and sometimes physical attack. This is a flag of the American Nativist Party. This party was established in the 1850s, and it was an anti-immigrant party. And so those Americans in the 1850s who were opposed to immigration targeted Jews coming from the German states. They also targeted the Irish as well. And so beginning in the 1850s, Jews began to be targets of verbal and sometimes physical abuse. During the Civil War, anti-Jewish intolerance increased dramatically on both sides, with the Union and the Confederacy making baseless accusations that Jews were opposing the opposite side. Lincoln's favorite general, Ulysses S. Grant, was told that some Jewish peddlers had illegally sold some of their merchandise to Confederate soldiers And when Grant heard this, he became furious. He labeled Jews, quote, an intolerable nuisance. And on December 17th, 1862, he issued Order Number 11. One historian has called this the most sweeping anti-Jewish regulation in all American history. So this is General Order Number 11, sent by Major General Ulysses S. Grant. And it said, the Jews as a class, violating every regulation of trade established by the Treasury Department and also department orders, are hereby expelled from the department within 24 hours from the receipt of this order. What this meant was, it was an order expelling Jews from those parts of the Confederacy that were under Union occupation. And so Jews were expelled from parts of Kentucky, Mississippi, and Tennessee, those parts that were under Union Army control. And as a result of Grant's expulsion order, Jewish families were forced out of their homes in Paducah, Kentucky, in Holly Springs, Mississippi, and Oxford, Mississippi. And some Jews were even sent to prison as a result of General Order Number 11. Now, this anti-Semitic mandate came as a shock to an American Jewish community that had rarely been discriminated against. And so protest rallies erupted in cities throughout the North. Prominent Jews vigorously objected to Grant's order. President Lincoln immediately directed Grant to revoke this odious Order Number 11. Lincoln wrote, to condemn a class of people is to condemn the good with the bad. I do not like to hear an entire class or nationality condemned on account of a few sinners. Yes, it was true. There were some Jews who were involved in violating the economic boycott against the South, but there were also Gentiles who were engaging in the black market. But Grant's Order Number 11 did not target Gentiles, and it did not just target those Jews involved in the black market. It targeted Jews as a class, and that is what made that order particularly odious. But after a nationwide Jewish protest, Lincoln revoked the order. And so he became the first and only president to revoke an official act of anti-Semitism that involved the US government. The order was rescinded, but mass evacuations of Jewish communities in Mississippi and Kentucky had already been carried out. Now, clearly this incident deeply distressed American Jews. It stirred fears about wholesale expulsions and restrictions that were once imposed against Jews in Europe. But the fact that American Jews were able to convince the President of the United States to rescind the order, that reassured American Jews that their hopes in America had not been misplaced. And in gratitude for Lincoln's sympathy for American Jews, a street in Jerusalem bears the name of our 16th president. I believe there's also a street in Jerusalem that's named after George Washington. Now, in the last quarter of the 19th century, millions of Jews came to America from Eastern and Southern Europe, many fleeing from Tsarist oppression. They were part of more than 25 million immigrants who arrived in this country between 1880 and 1924. That represents the largest influx of foreigners in American history. These newcomers from Eastern Europe were poorer and less literate than previous immigrants, and they encountered much more hostility from native-born Americans. This raised the fear in the minds of many Americans that the arrival of these new immigrants would somehow subvert American culture and American traditions, and that these new arrivals would never assimilate. And so here is a cartoon showing Uncle Sam feeling threatened by this wave of riffraff immigration, as it was called. And the title of this cartoon is "The High Tide of Immigration, a National Menace." Now, it should be noted that many American Jews of German origin who were long established in America shared the contempt of the general population towards East European Jews, who were referred to as Ostjuden, East Jews. And this new wave of East European Jewish immigration coincided with the birth of a new so-called scientific movement in America, and that was called eugenics. Eugenics claimed that all behavior was genetically determined, and that some groups possessed superior genes and others had inferior genes. And many proponents of eugenics regarded Anglo-Saxons and Nordics as occupying the top of the eugenics scale. So the concept of a white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, master Nordic race did not originate with Hitler. That idea was created in the United States decades before the Nazis came to power, with the emergence of the eugenics movement. Eugenicists believed that human qualities, such as talent and criminality and poverty, were passed through the blood onto the descendants. That defective humans were not only those carrying obvious diseases or handicaps, but those whose lineage strayed from the Germanic, Nordic, Anglo-Saxon ideal. The grand plan of the eugenics movement was nothing short of ethnic cleansing, to literally wipe away the reproductive capability of those deemed weak and inferior, the so-called unfit. And so here is a eugenics display saying some people are born to be a burden on the rest, that people of inferior genes would become somehow unemployed, would be a burden on American institutions. And to the eugenicists of the early 20th century, among the unfit were recent immigrants from Eastern Europe. Now, we should keep in mind that eugenics was not the ramblings of ignorant, unsophisticated individuals. It was promoted by professors of elite universities in America, by wealthy industrialists such as Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, and by government officials, including President Theodore Roosevelt. The Harriman Railroad fortune paid local charities to seek out Jewish, Italian, and other immigrants in New York and other crowded cities to subject them to deportation or forced sterilization. So no longer were Jews merely those who had failed to accept Christ as their savior, or greedy Shylocks intent on undermining American economy. Now, the newest arrivals from Eastern Europe came to be regarded as moral cripples from an inferior racial stock. Geneticists believed that Jews constituted a separate race with distinctive mental and physical characteristics. Some eugenicists supported policies to keep Jews out of the gene pool by forbidding them to intermarry. Decades later, the Nazis imported American eugenics to bolster their racial theories. Articles by some of America's most reputable journalists and scholars derided Jews with titles such as Jewish Criminality, White Slave Traffic and Jews, Will the Jews Ever Lose Their Racial Identity, and Are the Jews an Inferior Race? The most horrifying example of anti-Semitism in the United States in the early 20th century erupted in what was called the Leo Frank affair. Leo Frank was the manager of a pencil factory in Atlanta, Georgia. On April 26, 1913, a worker in the factory, a young lady by the name of Mary Fagan, was found raped and murdered. Frank, who was Jewish and who originated from the Northeast, was immediately arrested, tried, and convicted of the crime. There was not one shred of evidence that linked Leo Frank with the murder, yet the jury found him guilty and the judge sentenced him to hang. The jury convicted Leo Frank for several reasons, anti-Semitism being just one of them. They also resented him as an upper-class, educated Northerner. It was a perfect storm of class, religion, and sexual charges. But just before he was to be hanged, the governor of Georgia commuted his sentence to life in prison. And from that moment forth, the plotting to lynch Leo Frank began. During the summer of 1915, a group of citizens from Marietta, Georgia, the hometown of the murdered victim, they made careful plans to take the law into their own hands. A lynch party walked into the prison, unopposed, and abducted Leo Frank and hanged him. No one was ever charged with the crime. So the Leo Frank case came as a shock to the immigrant community, the immigrant Jewish community, and was particularly devastating to assimilated Jews. After all, Leo Frank was a man who was at the top of society. And if this could happen to him, it could happen to any Jew. The lynching was undoubtedly the worst instance of anti-Semitism in the history of American Jewry. But the most threatening era in the history of anti-Semitism in America was the time between the two world wars. It was part of the anti-foreign feeling that swept America following World War I. World War I brought terrible loss of life and tremendous upheaval. And after that came the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And so there was a great fear in American society that immigrants coming from Europe were importing communist or anarchist ideas. So here we see some cartoons of immigrants representing a threat that immigrants might try to replicate the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in the United States. And since some Jews were radicals, anti-Semites equated Jews with Bolshevism. The influenza epidemic that followed World War I was thought by some to be introduced by immigrants from Eastern Europe. The Ku Klux Klan was revived in the 1920s, and the Klan argued that Jews and Catholics were taking over the country. The Klan fashioned itself as the defender of white native-born Protestant interests in this country, and they regarded immigrants as a threat to American civilization. They thought that Catholics and Jews were unblendable, that the melting pot was more like a, quote, garbage can. Jews also, by and large, opposed prohibition, and that further fanned accusations of disloyalty, because by the 1920s, prohibition was the law of the land. And so there were charges that Jews were un-American, that they were undermining Christian and American values. Nevertheless, Jews were becoming prominent in movies and music and other forms of entertainment in the 1920s. And some anti-Semites feared that urban Jews were destroying white Christian culture in America. In addition to all of this, there was the vicious anti-Semitism of the protocols of the Elders of Zion that I discussed last week. It was this series of forged documents that purported a Jewish plot to control the world. And as I mentioned last week, it was translated into almost every language and is still a bestseller in the Middle East today. The commercial success of some American Jews fomented stereotypes of Jews as money manipulators who conspired to exploit Gentiles and wanted to undermine the United States as a Christian nation. Henry Ford, perhaps the most admired American of the 1920s, swallowed the protocols, hook, line, and sinker. In the 1920s, he printed a series based on the protocols of the Elders of Zion in his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent. Under the banner, The International Jew, Ford accused Jews of everything from world financial domination to fixing baseball games. The articles were immensely popular, and they ran for more than 2 years. The Dearborn Independent had the second largest circulation of any newspaper in the United States at the time. Then in 1927, Lewis Marshall of the American Jewish Committee got Henry Ford to agree not to publish anything from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Marshall organized a Jewish boycott of Ford motor cars, and so Henry Ford apologized. And skeptics doubted that his apology was sincere, because in 1938, he accepted the High Cross of the German Eagle, the highest honor the Nazi government could give to a foreigner. So fueled by fears of more immigrants coming to America from Southern and Eastern Europe, in 1924, Congress passed an immigration restriction law that severely restricted immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. And that law represented the greatest triumph of the American eugenics movement in national affairs. Now, this law came just a decade before the Nazis would rise to power in Germany. And so the 1930s was a time when Jews desperately sought havens of refuge. But the United States was now virtually closed to Jewish immigration because of this 1924 immigration law. Anti-Semitism was on the rise in the 1920s. By the 1930s, it would become a tidal wave when Jews were blamed for causing the Great Depression. In addition, Jews were prominent in the American Communist Party, as well as in other left-wing movements of the 1930s, and that only fed anti-Semitism from right-wing groups. During the 1930s, anti-Semitism began to affect the climate in which Jews were living. And so signs such as "Dogs and Jews Not Allowed" were posted in some beaches and hotels, such as this sign, where privileges of the swimming pool are extended only to approved Gentiles. There were signs on hotels, "No Hebrews or excuse me, no Hebrews or tubercular guests received." Even the wealthiest Jews in America were barred from entering certain social clubs and vacation resorts. Jews were faced with employment ads that stated only white Protestants need apply. So here's an ad. I'm sorry that it's so blurred, but if you'll focus here, "Applicants from Hebrews not desired." This is an ad from a hotel. The owner of one factory expressed the prevailing sentiment when he said, "We try to have only white American Christians in a factory, regardless of religion." I'll repeat that. "We try to have only white American Christians in our factory, regardless of religion." Jews couldn't get jobs in law or finance outside purely Jewish firms. And later on, that carried into housing discrimination, where restrictive covenants barred Jews from moving into certain neighborhoods in most major American cities, including Los Angeles. Elite universities imposed a quota system to limit the admission of Jewish applicants. Jews dealt with hiring and housing discrimination by constructing a parallel world that still exists to some extent today, where Jews created their own businesses and country clubs and lived in predominantly Jewish neighborhoods. They developed resorts such as the Borscht Belt, north of New York City. Ironically, the emergence of Jewish country clubs and vacation spots prompted anti-Semites to charge that Jews were becoming too clannish. So you couldn't win. Jews living in predominantly Christian neighborhoods would be assailed as Christ killers, particularly around Easter time. And there was other evidence of anti-Semitism in the 1930s. FDR's New Deal was seen by some as a Jewish conspiracy. Some anti-Semites thought that Roosevelt himself was Jewish. They referred to him as Rosenfeld or Rosenwelt, and they called the New Deal the Jew Deal. American Jews were increasingly seen as agents of international communism. Between 1933 and 1941, more than 100 anti-Semitic organizations emerged. And that is compared to just only 5 anti-Semitic organizations in all previous American history. So up until 1933, only 5 anti-Semitic organizations. Between 1933 and 1941, more than 100. The most popular radio program of the 1930s were broadcast by Father Charles Coughlin. His anti-Semitic tirades were heard coast to coast on the CBS radio network, which, by the way, was owned by William Paley, a Jew. In 1938, Father Coughlin was kicked off of CBS when he made the connection between Jews and communists based on Nazi documents. Nevertheless, his preaching intensified violence against Jews by Catholic youth gangs in big cities across the country. Yet another manifestation of anti-Semitism in the 1930s was the rise of the pro-Nazi German-American Bund that attracted some 25,000 dues-paying members, including some 8,000 uniformed stormtroopers. So this is a photograph of members of the German-American Bund marching in a town in New Jersey. The Bund carried out propaganda activities, they organized demonstrations, they maintained camps run like the Hitler Youth, and they launched physical attacks on Jews. In February 1939, the German-American Bund staged a rally in Madison Square Garden that attracted 19,000 attendees. Stephen Ross, a history professor from UCLA, recently wrote a book entitled Hitler in Los Angeles, which revealed that Nazis in the city planned to seize weapons and ammunitions in armories in order to launch terrorist attacks against high-profile Jews in Hollywood, Jews such as Al Jolson and Samuel Goldwyn. By killing Jewish film actors and film moguls, they wanted to incite attacks on Jews throughout America. Their plans included driving through Boyle Heights and machine gunning as many Jews as possible. Now, this plot was foiled when a Jewish individual by the name of Leon Lewis, whom most people never heard of, but there should be a memorial to Leon Lewis, he ran a spy operation to infiltrate every Nazi and fascist group in Los Angeles. And ultimately, that operation uncovered the plan to kill high-profile Jews in the movie industry. Now, as the noose tightened around many Jews in Germany, America could have admitted more refugees under the existing quota system, but it refused. The sentiment in the US State Department was decidedly anti-Semitic. Historians have referred to paper walls, that is, the use of bureaucracy, to deny immigrants entry into the United States. After World War II began in September 1939, most Americans didn't want to get involved in another European war. As late as autumn 1941, 80% of this country believed that America should stay out of the European war. Charles Lindbergh was the spokesman for the isolationist America First movement, and he blamed Jews for trying to get America to enter World War II. Rachel Maddow from MSNBC recently produced a podcast called Ultra, which reports on a little-known story about an ultra-right-wing pro-Nazi movement in America that plotted to overthrow the US government by force in the years leading up to World War II. These groups worked with an agent from Hitler's government, a man by the name of George Varick. And Varick colluded with some 20 sitting members of the US Senate and House of Representatives to spread Nazi propaganda, often at the expense of American taxpayers. The German government paid many of these congressmen to promote Nazi literature, and the congressmen would then send that propaganda to their constituents through the mail. And congressmen have what is called franking privileges. That is, they can send out mail without having to pay for the postage. The postage was essentially paid by American taxpayers. So these congressmen sending out Nazi propaganda through the mails, in essence, American taxpayers were footing the bill. Now, those congressmen were also associated with the America First Committee, a group with many anti-Semitic leaders. I strongly recommend you listening to this podcast. And as somebody mentioned last week, Steven Spielberg has obtained the film rights, so there will be a movie coming out about this. Well, the United States entered World War II after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. Now, opinion polls before and during World War II reflected widespread public fear and animosity towards Jews in America. The American Jewish community felt besieged and vulnerable at a time when Jews in Europe were being persecuted. In 1938, a public opinion poll asked this question: should we allow a larger number of Jewish exiles from Germany to come into the United States to live? When that question was asked in March of 1938, only 17% of respondents said yes. 75% said no. And in November of 1938, that question was asked again, and then 21% said, yes, we should allow a larger number of Jewish exiles from Germany, and this was after Kristallnacht, but 71% still said no. And so a quiet sense of desperation engulfed American Jews. They were afraid to speak out against attacks on European Jewry for fear of drawing unwelcome attention to themselves. Now, ironically, America's entry into World War II against racist Nazi Germany actually increased intolerance at home. One reoccurring poll question asked whether Jews in the United States had too much power. And so when that question was asked in May 1938, 36% of respondents said yes. By 1945, at the end of World War II, 58% of respondents said that Jews had too much power in the United States. So it seems that anti-Semitism actually increased during the war. Before America's entry into World War II, American public opinion was solidly opposed to increased Jewish immigration, despite the desperation of Jews in Germany and Austria to escape Nazi oppression. Great Britain accepted 10,000 Jewish children under the Kindertransport program. A similar bill was brought up in Congress to bring 20,000 Jewish children into the United States in 1939. It was called the Wagner-Rogers Act, but this bill never made it out of committee. And here is a poll question that said it has been proposed to bring to this country 20,000 refugee children from Germany, most of them Jewish, to be taken care of in American homes. Should the government permit these children to come in? Only 30% said yes, 61% said no. And that is why the Wagner-Rogers Act never came before Congress for a full vote. Some 550,000 American Jews fought alongside their countrymen in World War II. 36,000 American Jews were decorated for bravery. Yet Jews experienced anti-Semitism in the army about as much as they did in civilian life. During the war, rumors spread across the United States that Jews lacked patriotic fervor, that they were evading the draft. And such rumors were particularly publicized in military newspapers. And so this doggerel, entitled "The First American," appeared on American military bases. And let me just go past this. The first American killed in World War II, Mike Murphy. The first American bomber to sink a battleship, a Japanese warship, Colin Kelly. The first American flyer to down a Japanese plane, Eddie O'Hara. The first American to get 4 new tires, A.B. Cohn. So the idea that American Jews avoided the draft and they somehow profited economically during the war. And then there was this public opinion poll that asked, in your opinion, what nationality, religious or racial groups are a menace to America? When that question was asked in August of 1940, of the 5 groups you see listed here, Jews, Blacks, Catholics, Germans, Japanese, 17% of respondents identified Jews as the greatest menace to America, more than Blacks, Catholics, Germans, or Japanese. The question was asked again in February of 1941, and by then, 18% identified Jews, more than any other group. When the question was asked in October, on the eve of American entry into the war, by then 20%, 1 in 5 respondents said that Jews, more than any other group, were a menace to America. Now that percentage fell after America entered the war, and understandably you could see that now Japanese were seen as the greatest menace to America. But as the war continued, and that question continued to be asked, by June 1944, D-Day, now 24% of the respondents, 1 in 4, identified Jews as the greatest menace to America, far greater than any of these other groups. And that question was asked for the final time in March of 1945, yet still, Jews, more than any other group, were seen as a menace to this country. During the Holocaust, newspapers in the United States reported what happened to Jews, but these stories were relegated to the back pages. The New York Times, in particular, downplayed news of the Holocaust. Its Jewish publisher, Arthur Sulzberger, didn't want the Times to be regarded as a Jewish newspaper, and so he was reluctant to emphasize atrocities committed against European Jews. Now, much has been written about whether FDR did enough to save European Jews. Some argued that Roosevelt was crassly indifferent to the fate of European Jews, that he should have pressured Congress to liberalize immigration quotas, that he should have done more to rescue European Jews, that he should have negotiated with the Nazis to ransom Jewish lives, that he should have bombed concentration camps, all of which raises questions such as, was the rescue of European Jews even possible? What latitude did the president have? Was FDR anti-Semitic? Does the American Jewish community share some of the blame? Now, while it is true that the State Department worked to keep the quota of Jewish immigrants lower than what was permissible, between 1933 and 1945, the United States admitted 200,000 Jews. Now, when you think about the 6 million who died, 200,000 is not a very large number, yet it was more than any other country. In fact, it was twice as much as all the other countries combined. So you can see on this chart, the United States admitted 200,000 refugees and other countries much less. And then there was a question of the voyage of the St. Louis. So the St. Louis was a ship that left from Hamburg, Germany in June of 1939 with more than 800 passengers, almost all of whom were Jewish, who had landing certificates for Cuba. But when the ship reached Cuba, the Cuban dictator, Fulgencio Batista, only allowed a handful of Jews off the ship, and he refused to admit most of the 800. Well, the St. Louis then requested permission from the United States to allow the passengers to disembark in America, and they never received that permission. Ultimately, the ship returned to Europe on the eve of World War II. Now, some people have blamed Roosevelt for not admitting the refugees on the SS St. Louis. But only Congress, not the president, can change immigration laws. And we must remember that in June of 1939, the United States was mired in a deep depression. And most Americans felt that refugees would compete with Americans for scarce jobs. And so there was very little sentiment in America to bring in Jewish refugees. Public opinion was strongly anti-Semitic. And no one in June of 1939 knew there was going to be a Holocaust. And what a lot of people are not aware of, FDR interceded with the captain of the St. Louis to make sure that no passenger would be returned to Germany. So all the passengers on the St. Louis were admitted by Western democratic countries in Europe, in Belgium, in Holland, in France. Now, this was before World War II started. So no one knew that the Nazis would overrun those countries by 1940. So at the time, FDR saved the passengers from Nazi oppression by making sure that the ship would not return the passengers to Germany. So to condemn FDR or the United States for sealing the fate of those passengers is to assume that FDR knew Germany would conquer those countries and that there would be a Holocaust. And of the total 936 passengers, 930 were Jewish refugees. Of that total, 29 were allowed into Cuba, 288 disembarked in England, and the remaining 619 went to France, Belgium, and Holland, which were safe havens at that time. Now, in the end, a total of 227 would be victims of the Holocaust after Germany overran France, Belgium, and Holland. But President Roosevelt could not have possibly foreseen that. Now, What about the charge that Roosevelt should have ransomed Jewish lives? The Nazis did offer Jewish lives for ransom, and FDR turned those offers down for two reasons. First, he didn't believe that the Nazis could be trusted, felt that the offers of ransom were insincere. But more importantly, the president felt that giving money and equipment to Nazi Germany would only prolong the war and impede the primary objective of defeating Nazi Germany. Roosevelt consistently said the way to end the Holocaust is to defeat Nazi Germany militarily. Now, what about the charge that there was no effort to rescue Jews in Europe? Well, there was also no sentiment to help other victims of the Nazis. There was no sentiment to rescue Czechs or French imprisoned in Nazi war camps. And Roosevelt felt that any such effort would detract from the primary goal of defeating Nazi Germany. Also, there was never any effort to rescue 29,000 American POWs in German camps. The British and the American military were prepared to let these prisoners of war die rather than divert men, material, and air power from the war effort. But what about the failure to bomb Auschwitz? Well, the idea was that the Allies should have bombed concentration camps, and that would have saved thousands of Jewish lives. And that critique has been widely accepted by many people in this country. But military historians almost unanimously emphasize the near impossibility of a successful American bombing raid on Auschwitz. By 1944, only 13% of American aerial bombardment fell within 500 feet of its intended target. Only 1 in 5 bombers got within 5 miles of its target. Not only that, but there was a good possibility that even if the crematoria were destroyed, the Nazis would have continued to kill Jewish prisoners by other means. And there was the ethical dilemma. If you bomb the concentration camps, you're going to kill Jews. And another issue was, well, why not bomb the railroad tracks leading to the camps? But it's been proven that railroad tracks could be repaired in just hours. And also, it would require pinpoint bombing. Now, some Jewish organizations favored bombing of Auschwitz, but others opposed it because it would kill many Jews. But the bottom line is that the United States was committed to the military defeat of Nazi Germany, and bombing Auschwitz would risk men and aircraft that would delay the ultimate victory over Germany. But there were some things that FDR could have done. He should have given aid or encouragement to neutral countries to rescue Jews, or to the Vatican to rescue Jews. He also raised unrealistic expectations in holding refugee conferences, such as the Bermuda Conference and the Evian Conference. In the end of those conferences, there was no country willing to take in Jews, except for the Dominican Republic. FDR should have pressured the State Department to relax its immigration quotas, and he should have fired Breckinridge Long, who is the head of the immigration department of the State Department. Now, in later years, some critics condemned American Jews for not doing more during World War II to help European Jews. But to pass such harsh judgment really ignores the realities of how anti-Semitism virtually paralyzed the American Jewish community during the war. American Jews observed with horror what was happening to European Jews. And of course, German Jews were considered the most advanced and most integrated Jewry in the West. And so if it could happen to German Jews, then perhaps it could happen to American Jews. And so assimilated Jews in America were ambivalent about admitting refugees. and they feared what was happening in Europe could happen to them. So American Jews were reluctant to take a strong lead on the refugee issue. American Jews were divided, fearful, and they felt very much alone. Just think about those responses to the public opinion questions that identified Jews as the greatest menace to America. So I think instead of asking why American Jews were so silent during the Holocaust, the better question is, what could they possibly have done to save their brethren in Europe? Now, next week, we'll look at anti-Semitism in the decades following World War II, as well as the reasons for the disturbing rise in attacks against American Jews today. So that concludes this lecture, and now